Hi, welcome back to Rabbit Hole History, where each week for 6 weeks I dive into a historical topic that I'm interested in. If you're new, Season 1 is all about ancient Greece, and this is Episode 3. Last week's episode centered around mythology and religion in ancient Greece, and I learned a lot about the Greek gods that lived on Mount Olympus, strange ways many of them were born, and how they translated into and were parallels of later in historical periods like ancient Rome. I thought a nice next step into my ancient Greek rabbit hole would be the buildings and architecture. Like the mythology, architecture is one of the biggest and most prominent pieces of this historical period that still remain intact today, and they're considered marvels in human accomplishment and design. The design and architecture of ancient Greece can also be grouped into 3 distinct periods, which I also thought would be fun to dive into. It's something I also remember learning about when I was in elementary school as well. So let's get right back into it. Welcome back to Rabbit Hole History. So before we jump into the 3 main topics and I guess themes or periods of Greek architecture, I think it's important to start with where it all started, kind of what inspired it, or rather what didn't inspire it. It's also important to get our bearings because the early development of Greek architecture calls back to my first video on general Greek history and what kind of preceded it. If you haven't seen that video, you can definitely go back and give it a watch because I think it helps really contextualize kind of everything that I've been learning about. Anyway, but the early development and inspiration for classical Greek architecture actually comes from a civilization that we've talked about in the past, Mycenae. As we've learned, Mycenaean architecture and really Mycenae as a civilization was described as a big citadel or a big fortress that is mythological in nature and was just a huge fortress talked about in a lot of legends and tales. So this is kind of the exact opposite of what you might picture to be ancient Greek architecture. Even in these pictures that you see of, definitively Mycenaean architecture, it's very fortressy and militaristic almost, and you can just tell that that's the complete opposite. So it almost is like anti-inspiring to what was to come. You can also just see the difference that we'll talk about later in, the Greeks' use of columns. This trend towards more open space is just very different from Mycenaean architecture. Maybe the way that this all developed was kind of almost a rebellion from prior, what the ancient Greeks would consider ancient architecture. Maybe it was a rebellion of sorts to kind of flourish into more beautiful, open style. Of course, we have no way of knowing what the real influence was. Maybe that's a rabbit hole for another day. Maybe I'll just have to go back in time and ask somebody. But anyway, that is kind of the history leading up to what we're going to talk about. Now onto the orders of Greek architecture. So these 3 themes that were later identified in ancient Rome all kind of surround what is known as an order, which is a combination all having to do with the style of column that is used in the building. So the first order is called the Doric order, and I think it's kind of a hilarious place to start because it seems to be the plainest column, I guess is the best way you can describe it. My one source from worldhistory.org defines it as a vertical fluted column shaft, thinner at its top, with no base and a simple capital below a square abacus. The biggest and most well-known example you'll see of the use of Doric columns is actually the Parthenon. You can kind of see the simplicity of the columns, and there's so many of them on the Parthenon, but they really stand out. They're really powerful looking. They don't need a lot of the embellishments. It's a very beautiful type of architecture, and it's a good order, and clearly it stood the test of time. The second order of the three is the Ionic order. And this is going to sound silly, but I remember learning about the different types of Greek columns when I was in elementary school. And I remember specifically recalling the Ionic order because my teacher said that the columns look like little eyes on either end because it's circular and curved. It's like the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. It's just like something that stuck with me and I don't know why. Anyway, you can recognize Ionic order not just by the little eyes on the end, but the fact that it gets a little more elaborate on the top. It still has that classic Doric fluting shape, but you can see on the top, they're starting to get a little more elaborate and decorative with the style. There's actually not a lot of examples left standing of Ionic columns. A lot of them have been destroyed or lost to time. Some examples include the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus. It was unfortunately destroyed by invaders, so only models and reconstructions of the temple exist today. So the third order of Greek columns and design is the Corinthian era. You can see that it's slightly similar to the Ionic order in the way that it's very decorative and more elaborate, but it goes even further and is often stylized in all of these little vines and leaves and almost like a big plant on top of the column. You're going to see a lot of Western architecture with this style of column, and to quote my source from worldhistory.org, it is difficult to walk in any modern city and not see examples of them in one form or another. I think because this is the most elaborate and lavish looking of the three orders, you'll see a lot of this translated in later architectural design periods. Most notably, the next historical period, ancient Rome. You can see Corinthian-style columns on very significant buildings such as the Pantheon. And today in the United States, most of our government buildings in the capital, Washington, D.C., are built and designed after the classical Corinthian style. This is a little mini rabbit hole within the rabbit hole, but as I was researching modern examples of the Corinthian style, most notably in the United States Capitol, I learned that when they were building these columns, they not only incorporated the classical leaves on top of the columns, they actually included Native American tobacco plants. I think it's kind of a fun way to incorporate, what the United States is while still using and taking from the original inspiration of ancient Greece. So now that we've talked about kind of the three stylistic orders, I want to quickly kind of talk about what they were actually used for. So many of what survives today are seemingly more public buildings, places of worship, and that's pretty much true. Domestic buildings weren't really the kind of buildings that they used columns for, so you don't see many surviving examples of what a domestic house would look like. But there are still some examples of what a house would have looked like during this period. It just doesn't really rival public structures. Which makes sense. I mean, in so many ancient cultures and civilizations, what still remains today are big public projects. And so the same can be said for ancient Greek architecture. The public buildings that are more rectangular and represent temples and stadiums, those are what remain today, and those are probably what come to mind when you think ancient Greek architecture. So that's where we're going to pause the rabbit hole dive for this week. I think for next week, we're going to talk more about art and entertainment and drama. So I think kind of ending on the architectural design is going to be a good segue into next week's topic. So thank you so much for listening, watching, and don't forget I have 2 more videos in this series so far, and so this is video number 3. I'm gonna have 3 more videos after this, and I'm really looking forward to recording and filming those, especially for week 5. I am gonna try out an ancient Greek recipe, which I am super excited for. So again, thank you so much for watching. Give me like, thumbs up, comment, subscribe, all that weird promotional stuff that I don't really know how to do yet. But if you enjoyed, thank you so much, and I look forward to showing you what I'm going to learn about next. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next week.